Welcome to Concerning the Spiritual and Art, a podcast exploring spirituality, consciousness, and the creative process. I'm your host, Martin Benson. All right, y'all, welcome back to the podcast. I have a magical episode for you today with Alessandro Keegan, an incredible painter, art historian, writer, and man, this episode will not disappoint, especially to those out there interested in magical and mystical things. We talk a lot about not only his painting practice and its relationship to like alchemical traditions and esoterica, occultism, but we also talk about just mystery of spirituality and consciousness itself. He spoke about certain experiences that he's had in his life that sort of initiated him to experiencing like a bigger state of his own consciousness and sort of opening the doors to these bigger questions that he had about reality that sort of led him down the path that he is on right now. Just so many places that this conversation went to. Is such a beautiful exchange. Just so much amazing information that Alessandro has. He's such a scholar in this space. He wouldn't agree to that term, but he just knows a lot and has a lot to offer. And it was just a really amazing, fun time. Him and I both just had just an incredible time just sharing ideas and talking about these topics that aren't generally talked about in the mainstream. So I think a lot of you out there are going to really be surprised by it, enjoy it, or at the very least, you're going to learn about something magical and new. So here you go, Alessandro Keegan. All right, Alessandro, welcome to the podcast, man. How are you doing today?
Hi, Martin. Thank you for asking me to speak with you today.
Yeah, for sure. We were talking before. Alessandro and I both have newborns at home, and we're like, our sleep is on a little minimal, but we're happy to have coffee and be here together. And so I feel like we're kindred spirits, kind of in the same familial boat right now.
Yeah,
But
it's good. The sleeplessness will put me in a more liminal kind of consciousness state. So
good, man. Good. We'll see what opens up and where we go, because man, ever since I've come across your work, I've just been so blown away by just the mystical and magical qualities of them. They feel almost like alchemical in a lot of ways, especially the way your compositions are. They feel very intentional, very powerful, but they also have this flair of sheer uniqueness, like all your own. Like you're really developing this very beautiful expression and unique language in your painting, as you know, stylistically. But I know there's so much more happening in them, and I'm just so curious about sort of how you got into making this kind of work. Like, where did this sort of begin for you in terms of your explorations, not only in abstraction, but in sort of these maybe alchemical, magical, mystical kind of feeling that you're bringing into it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been making art for a very long time. I began when I was very young. Um, I I've had a very long journey, and it's not like the kinds of paintings, the sort of imagery that you see in my work. It's not like that just kind of sprung up overnight,
Yeah.
or came from like some single vision. I think sometimes it can seem that way when you see an artist present a body of work that seems very fully formed. But, I've been making paintings, since I was very, very young. And, there's a lot of formative events, I think, when I was younger, that led me in a certain direction with my art. I also did not necessarily see myself becoming an artist until maybe I was in my late teens or early 20s, or thinking of that as like a career direction for myself. When I was younger, if you asked me when I was like, I don't know, 14 or something, what I wanted to do with my life, I probably would have said I wanted to get into science or something like that. And I think that there was a lot of formative events I can talk about that sort of put me in the direction of questioning a lot of the foundations of the universe and the nature of the human mind. And then that, in some ways naturally leads towards some study of esoterica and related phenomenon and experiences with that. And then it also, leads into the path of art. And I guess when I think the decision for me in my teens to really focus on art, it was because I had had all these experiences that made me curious about the human mind and curious about what was beyond the physical plane, these kind of visionary experiences that I can talk to you about a little bit.
Yeah. Is there one in particular that comes to mind that you feel like was really poignant for you as like a direction shifter?
Yeah. It's hard to say. I had early experiences in my youth that were just very strange, or they were bordering on being sort of waking dream experiences. And I've written about these and spoken about these sometimes, and I don't exactly know what those were per se. They were just, I talk of them as like slippages or breakages in my day-to-day reality. Like I would just see a giant owl in the room and then it would go up into a lampshade and disappear, and these kinds of things. And then in my teens, as one does, I started experimenting with psychedelics and, trying a variety of different psychedelics. And I think I wasn't really into the idea of using drugs as a kind of party or entertainment or recreational kind of thing. It was really this quest that I was already on at that time for exploring my mind.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing like that, because at such a young age to kind of like think about like these substances or these compounds in that kind of way, because I would say a majority of kids of that age who are experimenting with any kind of substance or compounds are thinking about it in the opposite way, right? Like to party, to escape. But you're already sort of initiated in some subtle level on this path of like awakening your consciousness or like connecting with like a deeper fabric of reality that's beneath what we're sort of distracted by in the material plane. And so like that to me itself is just like a fascinating anecdote about you, because you've been on this for a long time. Like there's something natural about your gravitation into these spaces. And I think it's amazing that you said you kind of wanted to be a scientist at one point. Well, I would say that kind of where you've gone in art is like you're kind of doing that in some other way. Like it's not like rigorous materialist science, but like you're definitely exploring a science of the mind and the body and the spirit in some way through the creative act, which I find to be just a fascinating thing in and of itself.
Oh, I'm good that it comes across that way, actually, because that is what I hope to explore, But yeah, I was definitely a weird kid for that kind of purpose, and I had some interesting psychedelic experiences. I would say that one that I've talked about a lot was a very kind of cosmic vision. I don't want to get into too much detail with it because it is a very abstract thing to express, but I was at that time already taking psychedelic drugs, and I had friends who were also kind of weirdos too and sort of outsiders. And so they were kind of cool with this kind of exploration of consciousness and talking about magic and, occultism and its relationship to quantum physics and stuff. And also like, I will say like some of it was to kind of fit in or find a kind of subculture, because I was also like when I was like 16, by that time, 17, I was already into very kind of subculture music, like early industrial music, like Throbbing Gristle and that kind of stuff, and Psychic TV and those kinds of bands that were also kind of like occult and related to chaos magic and stuff. But this one particular vision, I would say, gave me a kind of, it was this very cosmic, you and I talked about this term that people use sometimes, like a download of information. And it did sort of feel like that kind of download. It's interesting that we use like the technological language, to talk about these things that are not technological. But anyway, it was this kind of download coupled with visual perceptions that were not exactly inside the world, that were not exactly before the eye, but were kind of inside my mind in a way. And to not get into too much explanation of that vision, it did, I think, give me some kind of baseline for how I began to perceive the universe after that,
Hmm.
and how I came to understand other kinds of anomalous perceptions, things that
Yeah.
didn't quite fit with
Yeah.
a rationalist, empirical view of the universe.
Hmm.
So that was like my early start, and I did explore that in my art. Going into my late teens, early 20s, I went to college at SUNY Purchase, which was actually for a state college. It actually had a really great art program. And,
Cool.
I met a lot of cool artists there who are still practicing artists today, actually. It was a very good program. And I began to sort of explore these ideas of, the empirical world not being quite what it seems. But, here's the thing. It's like the kind of imagery that you see in my work today, these sort of alchemical vessels and crystalline forms and
Hmm.
orbs and circles and eggs and stuff like that. These sorts of abstract, but also translucent or voluminous kind of forms in my work, that was kind of there at the beginning, but it hadn't fully formed.
Hmm.
That kind of language in painting is the product of, experiences and thoughts and experimentations with painting, for the past like 20 years,
Yeah,
so
exactly. Right. It doesn't just like happen, like you were saying earlier, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's kind of like this journey toward what you're making now. And like everything that you were exploring in your past kind of like led you to sort of distilling these ideas or these visions or these imageries and expressions down to what they are right now. And it's like, and I think that will continue to happen as you continue to paint for more and more time. Like they'll continue to find new ways of expressing themselves in ways that like you can't fully comprehend in this moment. But that to me is the journey of a true artist, is that you're constantly like pushing and evolving the way that you're trying to communicate through paint, through imagery and form, and so to speak. Like I remember when we were on the phone the other day just to kind of chat and get to know each other a little bit before we're right here on the podcast, we were talking about just sort of the limitations of language itself. Like even thinking about the psychedelic space, like you can never fully express this vision that you had, that cosmic vision, through language at all. Like you can touch on it a little bit or you can allude to it, but like no words or arrangement of sounds could ever fully embody the totality of what that experience was like. And that's why I think painting is such a magical, beautiful process, because it's creating a new kind of language that might be able to penetrate past some of the walls or barriers that linguistics can't necessarily, because of shared information or agreed upon terms or what have you. So I find that to be a very interesting component to your work too, because you are communicating very strongly, but without using words, maybe in titles, but the image itself is initiating a new form of communication, as is all painting, especially abstract painting, because it's a challenge for a lot of people to be
yeah.
able to see. But if you've seen enough art and you've been in this path for long enough and you look at some of the work you're making, you can see how highly intentional and thoughtful these forms that you developed are, and the way that you arrange them compositionally. One thing I'm curious about is, in terms of how you compose your images, are you referencing or influenced by like older, like alchemical, like diagrams or geometric glyphs or sacred geometry or things of this nature? Like how does that kind of play into some decision making within the painting you do?
Yeah, that's a great question actually, and very well put. I think that, art is really to fill in these gaps that language can't quite fill. But I think that's a very important question, because sometimes, when you say that the work of art was inspired by some kind of a experience that you had while in meditation or a psychedelic experience, there's this assumption that it's somehow you visualize these
Mm-hmm.
things in your mind, and then you're translating those as if, something, some,
Here's your painting right here. Do it.
yeah, psychedelic drugs like produce it like some AI program, and you just instantly have an image there to photocopy onto your canvas. But really, the kinds of experiences that I have, both in sober meditation and psychedelic experiences when I was younger, and these kinds of things, these kinds of experiences also hardly find a language in the visual either.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have to look at everything around me in order to find something that resonates with that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, when I look at alchemical manuscripts like the Splendor Solis or something, where there's those vessels and there's like a bird turning red inside of it, those do speak to me on some kind of intuitive level. Also, tarot cards are something that I use as a way of kind of activating that allegorical language inside of myself, just to kind of meditate on.
Yes.
And other symbols, around me, cultural, from literature and so forth, also have informed the kind of work that I've created. And something that's probably central to my work, an image that appears in every one of my paintings now, is this orb that's either an egg or it's some kind of circular form. It looks maybe like an eye or a crystal ball or some kind of gemstone, the kind you would see set into medieval reliquaries or something like that. This perfectly polished liquid gem dewdrop kind of crystal. That first started entering into my work in some form almost 10 years ago.
Wow.
While I was working, and this might surprise some people who don't know me, for a brief period of time, I had to work as a diamond grader at the Gemological Institute of America.
Oh, wow.
Which seems like a strange career shift, but, I had to find work. And so
that's the life of an artist right there, y'all.
Exactly.
It's just, this is what we do.
And they, they paid me while I was getting training there. So, I could get, paid and get trained. And then I would work in a lab in the dark and I'd be looking at diamonds under a microscope. And it was what it was. I didn't like that job. Sorry, Gemological Institute of America. But, I've moved on since then. But it was fascinating to look at these gemstones on a microscopic level, to see what was inside of them. A lot of times within those stones will be other crystals. So you'll be looking into a diamond and then you'll see this little blood drop kind of form floating inside of it. And that'll be a garnet inclusion in the center of the stone. Yeah. And they're these really kind of beautiful. And sometimes I would turn to my coworkers and say, "Oh, it looks like a Roberto Matta painting inside." And they'd be like, "Who's that?" I don't know. But anyway,
what are you talking about?
But, so I was doing that job, and I think it was during that time that I began, I was, already thinking about mysticism and its relationship to my art. But I think it was during that time that I began to think of the crystal or the clear form as a way of physically capturing that which is invisible or intangible. And so when you see that form, it comes from me working as a diamond grader, and it comes out of that, but it's not directly related to my old job. It's because in that form, I saw a way of capturing light, a kind of ineffable atmosphere, something that is non-physical, condensed into this physical vessel that's totally clear and transparent.
Yes. Oh man, that's amazing. Yeah, because when I think about like crystalline structures too, like I think about them in that similar way, like they are some sort of like gateway in some sense to like and if you want to use a scientific term, some kind of like quantum, like non-linear space of energy, of light that is permeating all of the cosmos all the time. But I also think about just like from a mathematical perspective, like the geometries of those molecules, and then underneath that, the atoms, like just how perfect the symmetries, the geometries, the balancing of like all those crystalline structures underneath them as being almost like a power grid of
Mm.
like being able to not only capture but transmit light in and of itself. I just find them anytime I go into like a crystal shop or jewels. There's this place, I live in New Orleans, and
Mm.
there's this place. It's like this one of the most like fancy, expensive antique stores you've ever been to in your whole life, like multi-million-dollar jewels and paintings and like micro mosaics that are like $900,000, like just the most insane, exquisite, like kind of craftsmanship and materials that you could find in the city. And they have these gems in there, and I'll go in there just to look at them. Like you're looking at like a I don't know how many carats, but a giant like yellow topaz or whatever. And it's just like, it's mind-blowingly beautiful. And I love the way that you incorporate it into your work, but I also love that you're using it almost as a symbolic device to point to a transcendent, ineffable space that is beyond or contained so deeply underneath the material experience that we can't perceive it. I think that's just like now, like thinking about your work and looking at it now, like I can't wait to go back and look at it again and sort of see where these jewels are placed and sort of how you're using them. But it makes perfect sense to me, because if you look at like any sort of history, you mentioned like medieval reliquaries, or like I remember I went to London once, and we got to see the crown jewels, and like looking at these jewels, like they're obviously used for some kind of power, whether it's just the beauty and material wealth. But I think there's an esoteric or sort of subtler energetic spiritual power to these forms, which is why they've been so I don't know, sought after and
Mm. I
cared
mean,
for.
absolutely. I mean, John Dee used a scrying, well, he used the scrying black mirror, but he also used scrying crystals. People, the cliche is looking into a crystal ball,
Mm-hmm.
and of course, like crystal shops, that have different energies to them is kind of a cliche of the new age. But
Yeah,
this is a very ancient thing that
exactly.
gemstones are used to give this kind of magic aura to things because of that aesthetic property that they have, the way they bend light and move
Mm-hmm.
light. I always found that fascinating also working GIA, that one of the features of a diamond in specific, it's one of the only crystal forms that doesn't bend light. So light actually just passes through it like glass. But
Wow.
most gemstones actually have some kind of refractive quality where they split
Mm-hmm.
light. But I was just like baffled that this solid matter form interacts with this kind of ineffable, intangible, particle wave thing that is called light. It was
Mm-hmm.
just so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, John Dee uses the crystal for scrying. Actually, I think in the British Museum they have like the tiny crystal orb that he
Mm-hmm.
used to
Wow.
divine with, and so forth, and
It's
many
amazing.
other examples throughout history.
Yeah, you see it, yeah, in all sorts of cultures, even in
Yeah.
the East. I mean, it's unbelievable. But I think what's so fascinating, like about like light itself, and like the you mentioned like particle wave, like there's so many mysteries that like even now, like where we can confront from a materialist point of view, like even like the most staunch materialist scientists can can't help but admit the fact that they just don't know what's going on when they think
Yeah,
about quantum physics. Like it
I
is
know.
such a mystery to us. Like,
Yeah.
and I think consciousness seems to be like the key to maybe unlocking these mysteries if we focus on the nature of consciousness itself and like what that is. And I think science is definitely diving into that. I mean, that's the big question in science is the nature of consciousness, especially in relationship to the brain. And you have like the brain being either like an antenna, a receiver of consciousness, which is always pervading the entire cosmos at all times, or it's a generator of consciousness. So consciousness begins with the brain and ends with the brain. I think about the latter of them just based on my own experiences, seeing how consciousness is sort of in everything, even in, I know how odd this might sound to a lot of people out there, but inanimate objects, essentially. like there's consciousness in all of it. And so that's something that me personally, I'm super fascinated by. And I think these esoteric traditions are sort of exploring consciousness in these incredibly scientific ways, even though we might not want to call it that. Is there any sort of like tradition within like sort of like the occult or the esoteric sort of lineages that you feel is like super fascinating to you, or any figures that like really have just like exploded your mind and got you thinking in new ways in relation not only to like your art but just life itself?
Yeah. I don't I'm one of those people who's like, I don't really belong to any group or have any particular religious affiliation or occult affiliation. I've sort of been fascinated by all of it. And I
Mm-hmm.
find in a lot of different schools of thought, different kinds of things that inspire me or interest me. A little bit of theosophy, a little bit of chaos magic and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really subscribe to any one particular worldview. But that said, like there are certain questions that each of these groups, these kind of occult groups, raise that I do find very interesting. I would say though that, if I had to say what my perspective was formed by, um, I do think that, as a young person being into that kind of like early industrial kind of subculture kind of stuff, I do think, you know, chaos magic. I know it's the most edgiest sounding kind of thing in the world,
Yeah.
but the general philosophy behind chaos magic, which is a kind of almost scientific approach to occultism, or this kind
Mm-hmm.
of experiment, testing a hypothesis kind of approach to
Yeah.
occultism, did form a lot of my approach to um, understanding my own mind, or trying to, I don't want to say channel, but try to um uh negate my own authorship sometimes in creating art, uh to try to practice my own sort of mediumistic art practice at
Yeah.
times. I think a
Yeah.
lot of that came out of that, like, books like Liber Null, for instance, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
chaos magic like tradition.
Yeah.
Which I know it sounds very weird, like people think chaos magic and it sounds like something like scary, but
Remember, these are words, right? Like, and
yeah,
words do
exactly.
not define the
Again,
thing.
back to
Yeah.
no definition. And then I would say,
Yeah.
one of the occult writers, not so much as an artist, but more as like a thinker who influenced me a lot, especially early in my life, was Austin Osman Spare,
Mm,
who was an early mediumistic artist, 1900s, 19 teens. He predates surrealism, but he did a lot of automatic drawing kind of stuff
mm,
that is similar to surrealism. And speaking of language, actually, he had this concept of what he called neither, like
mm,
neither this or neither that. And it was approaching one's art without any kind of names or definitions for the things that
mm.
you're representing or forming. So
Wow.
that kind of, and he was also involved in early like occultism, like he
Mm.
knew Aleister Crowley and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so I think like that kind of thread has influenced me, though maybe not so much today. I kind of am off on my own trip now, but I
Yeah.
think early on that was very formative for me.
Well, I think that's what's amazing is like that because of the world we live in now, like we have access to so much knowledge and information about these traditions or these practices or these figures
Mm.
within these traditions that, predating the internet, you might have had a lot harder time doing it. You probably would have had to fly over to England and go to some library down in the, look at old books, or you'd have to, really work hard. But now we can like really access it all. But I think what's exciting about it is just like, I think evolution is sort of seems to be the thumbprint of like everything happening. Like everything wants to like continue to become more novel and evolve and grow and find new forms of expression. And I think what we're seeing now, maybe in this era, is like spirituality, mysticism, magic, like are coming back, and and maybe they're trying to find a new foothold, a new expression in the modern world in this hyper technological age, which I contemplate that a lot, like what that looks like. And when you mentioned like the neither this nor neither that, I immediately thought of like there's a sort of Advaita Vedanta philosophy practice, which is like the non-dualist philosophy tradition within Hinduism. And they have this practice called neti neti. It's like not this, it's not that. It's not, you know what I mean? Like you do this meditation where literally you're negating everything as not being the thing you're looking for. And I guess the point is eventually it all falls apart, almost like maybe like a Zen koan, like eventually it just breaks the intellect, it breaks the mind in such a way that it opens it to another level of thinking. And I think that idea is very important to me personally, is this notion of like never feeling like you fully got it. Like, because it's just the second you think you fully understand something or you're fully like integrated with whatever, like something's going to happen to be like, nope, and knock you off your high horse. And so I think staying in this place of like wonder and curiosity and exploration and openness is such a more healthy place to be. And I think as artists, like that's, I think, where the rubber meets the road, is continue to be in these spaces of open questioning and exploration, while at the same time, like feeling like we're evolving and growing and becoming more connected to a grander level of our being, so to speak. And I definitely can see, like, just hearing you talk and seeing your work, like I see that you're genuinely and authentically like on that path, which is such a beautiful thing to witness, because it's inspiring for me, because I think we're all in that boat together trying to figure out what this mystery of life is. And especially in, I feel like, the times we live in now, where everything is becoming so focused on materialists and technological ends, that seeing someone who's oil painting and making these incredible pieces, like getting back to just like sort of basic materials, is just for me very inspiring. It's something that I do also personally as an artist. It's like the more we get into technology, I'm not a Luddite, but like we need to also go back to like slowing down and trying to like rehash some maybe old practices or traditions and find new evolutions in them. Do you
Absolutely.
think about, yeah, you think about that as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, actually, that painting is a kind of slowing down. Because, I went through a period where I was making more automatic drawings or allowing these kind of quick accidents to happen and responding to that. And I think that that's a fine approach to allowing indeterminacy in the universe to work through your art. But the kind of painting that I've been making for the last 5 or 6 years or so is a lot more controlled and a lot more methodical. And my reason for doing that wasn't necessarily to have control over it or to, make this kind of rigid parameter for my work. There still is a lot of moments of, coincidence and accident that happen. It was more to slow down.
Yeah.
I wanted the paintings to go slowly for me, so that the big gap in finishing like one big gradient of gray in the background of one of my paintings, in that gap of time, however long it takes, 8 hours or 10 hours for me to blend it perfectly, there would be so much going on within my mind. I would kind of be able to step back from the work and have this kind of experience of like almost eternity in that moment of doing it. So the slower I painted, the more methodically I painted, the more I felt some kind of, that invisible area within me was being, fed or nourished, by the practice. And then, going back to technology, this is interesting. Like it does seem like it hasn't become a full-blown art world trend or phenomenon necessarily, that like occult art is back or something like that.
Yeah.
Not that it ever was here, but
yeah, it was
occult
always
art
underground.
right. It's always been kind of at the edges.
Yeah.
But I do feel that more so in the last maybe 5 to 10 years or so, I have been seeing some inklings of art that is not quite figurative, not quite abstract. It's drawing upon either transcendentalist ideas, transcendentalist painting, or spiritualism or occultism, or there's, if not even that, if it's a little bit more kind of secular or empirical or something, maybe it's at least interested in the mind or the realm of dreams, as the surrealists were. I've been seeing that emerging more and more in the art world. It's kind of interesting to me, and maybe a relief to me in a way, because I've been sort of making that kind of work forever. And so it's like kind of vindicating. I'm like, oh, you see, my work has a context finally.
Right.
But yeah, no, that's kind of how it feels. But at the same time, I am wondering if, this is a kind of an indication of something that's happening on a larger scale in society. Maybe it's a side effect of global phenomenon that we've passed through. COVID, of course. There's been terrible wars going on over the last few years, or if it is a side effect somehow of technology, and how technology, especially information technology, has become more and more integral to our lives. It's also replaced a lot of things that happened in the kind of physical space, like we're talking on Zoom now,
Right.
instead of
Exactly.
sitting in a room together,
Exactly.
And one thing that I have thought is that, perhaps, especially during COVID, as we've been living more in a kind of technological world, we are becoming less physical as beings. I know this might sound like I'm going out, but
No, not at all.
that in immaterial side of ourselves that
Yes.
kind of floats, the ghost that's in the shell, is activated a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because we're existing so much in this kind of ethereal realm.
Yes.
I wonder if that's part of it. I don't know exactly, but
It could be a combination of all these things. And because I'm noticing exactly what you're noticing too, that there is some kind of shift happening. And I think there's so much instability in our sort of culture and our planet right now, especially depending on like what you have access to. I mean, I'm sure there are people who live in the middle of nowhere, who have no TV, who are doing just fine,
yeah.
listening to the birds and growing their food and just living off the grid and doing that. But like
Yeah,
for a
it's a
lot of
very
us,
Western American centric perspective.
yeah,
I acknowledge that,
for sure. But it is the world that we, especially us, and probably a lot of whoever's listening to this, they probably have a phone or a computer.
Yes.
They have access to technology like that we're dealing with. And I think it's bringing up a lot of existential questions, especially in the face of like climate disasters that are happening, or in the face of what happened with COVID, or political upheaval and wars, and so to speak. Like people are turning within more, wanting to understand what's beyond all this craziness that obviously we have no control of. So I think that could be a part of it as well. I don't know. I find that there is more of a ripeness within culture to be more open to ideas that are that have been there for a long time, but have been sort of underground or taboo, especially with like psychedelics. You look at psychedelics that are being talked about on the mainstream news as
Right.
being therapeutic. Like, hey, you're having a midlife crisis, go take a psilocybin journey, or whatever. Maybe not that like overt, but like I think you understand what I mean. It's like all these things are happening. And so I think it's a beautiful time of possibility. At least this is how I look at it in my mindset, is like, although there's so much suffering and difficulty and questions about the viability of our future, that within all of that, there is such immense possibility to maybe build something new. And I think what art can do is maybe help us ask these questions so we can dive deeper, or they can inspire us. It can inspire us to maybe like take a chance on a new idea, or explore a new feeling.
Yeah. I mean, it feels so interesting to me. Like I was aware of artists like Agnes Pelton and Hilma af Klint, like back when I was in college, but they, had not been exhibited very widely. Agnes Pelton was just kind of this beautiful. And I love that their art has emerged into the mainstream, but I'm still kind of like amazed that it has, but those artists have now started to become, very central to a lot of contemporary art that I see, especially Hilma af Klint, I think.
Yeah.
Who's also been on my mind because I've been reading Julia Voss's biography. I'm like
Oh,
almost finished with
cool. I
that.
want to read
So
that. Oh
it's
man.
excellent. She
Yeah.
definitely does amazing research. But so I've been reading that. So I think that's kind of in my mind here. And there's a lot of reasons for these artists to be in the zeitgeist right now that I find, are equally important. It's not just all about occultism. It's a
Hmm.
whole kind of revision of, the idea of modernism and women artists who had been excluded in the past,
Hmm.
especially, Hilma af Klint, who's, going to the Academy of Arts at a time that's very, sexist towards women in the arts at
Hmm.
that time. And then there's, the questions of early abstraction, so forth. And that's actually another thing that I find interesting is it's almost a reversal back to the original intentions of modernism and abstraction that I see with a
Yes.
lot of art today. If you look, and there's that Tate exhibit at the Tate in London
Yes.
that just happened recently, right? And it's af Klint and Modrian. But you can say Modrian, you can look at Kandinsky, of course. A lot of these artists were reading theosophy, they were
Yep.
going to seances,
Yep.
August Strindberg,
Channeling, mediums.
channeling, and it's almost as if the original intentions of modernism were to kind of open up human consciousness, were to kind of do away with these sort of definitions of forms and
Hmm.
find these new abstract languages to kind of talk
Yes.
about the nature of reality. And maybe that, I'm just saying, like, that's one of the many reasons why artists like Agnes Pelton and Hilma af Klint and these artists who were kind of occult or too
Hmm.
mystical early on to be in the history books have started to reemerge. It's because they're offering a new language and a way to kind of revisit that project of early
Yes.
abstraction again.
Yeah, because I feel like it got kind of hijacked by like a more of like a rationality of
Mm.
abstraction. I think of like Clement Greenberg and like
Mhm.
the way that like modernist like painters were being sort of defined through just pure form and visual perception, but like kind of like didn't talk about all the other things that are behind
Yeah.
perception, which is consciousness and this idea of like maybe potential other worlds or spaces where these things are coming through. I mean, you mentioned like even when you're painting, like you don't say it outright as like, channeling, but like you're trying to be a vessel for like some kind of energy beyond your own individuated ego to move through you to create something of value for others in like a in that beautiful sort of
Yes.
sentiment way. I feel the same way. Like I don't know how to explain it, but like when you're in the states of flow, states of pure presence where you're kind of emptying your whole vessel and just letting what's happening come through you, decisions are made like that, like intuition. A problem comes up, you just don't even think you solve it. You don't ruminate on it too much. I mean, there are times when I'm sitting there ruminating a long time about how do I solve it, but there are those magical times where it just seems like the painting just painted itself.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel that
Well, no,
way.
and that gets into like, another thing about early modernism is, another influence of mine and an art school of thought that I love in the early 20th century is surrealism.
Mm-hmm.
And the surrealists are all about these kinds of games for removing the self from the art, or they're practicing automatic drawing, sometimes seances outright,
Mm-hmm.
doing these kind of self-hypnosis or channelings. But the frustration I have with surrealism, and there were some critics at the time that kind of criticized this, like I think like Georges Bataille criticized this in surrealism as well, the writer. But it's that the surrealists kind of like purged the mythos from that work, the mythological
Mm-hmm.
kind of Jungian archetypal element from it, and replaced it more with a kind of Freudian psychological
Oh man.
interpretation,
Yes.
which is, that's fine. That's one model of the
For
universe
sure,
that
right?
you can have,
I have my
but
issues with Freudian
yeah,
analysis
it's
and
reductive,
models.
and,
Exactly.
and a lot of his things have been criticized. A lot of his statements have been criticized, but, like the surrealists, though, were tapping into something very true, though. They
Mhm.
were getting into that mystical territory of
Yeah.
allowing maybe another consciousness. And I can talk about like what I think about the idea of entities being channeled by artists as well, because I've written
Yeah.
on mediumistic art and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I feel like the surrealists were doing that, but then also kind of putting up this wall of like, oh no, it's the subconscious, it's the
Right. Exactly.
material mind, and
Yep. Trying to like not go there because it's so hard to go there that they just write it off, or they just put it in this simple little box of, yeah,
yeah,
the subconscious. Like, there you
yeah,
go. But like, that's why, like, I love that you mentioned Carl Jung and Freud, because I always look at that like relationship and then that split between those two schools of thought, just to be a really fascinating point within Western culture,
yeah,
right? Like, in terms of
absolutely.
how the Freudian sort of ideas kind of took over, in most ways. I mean, of course you have the Jungian collective unconscious, the archetypes. We see that a lot in art and writing. We see it throughout time in mythology. I always love Joseph Campbell and his ability to kind of like look at mythology across the planet through the lens of Carl Jung. But when I think about my own experiences, mystical experiences, lucid dreams, psychedelics, deep states of meditation, or spontaneous just insights, or spontaneous openings, or whatever, I don't know whatever you want to call it.
Hmm.
They do speak to this like kind of universal space of, that could be like the collective unconscious, like where all of these, like, or like I think in Indian or Hindu culture, like the Akashic
Hmm.
records, or the space where like all time is logged, all information, all ideas, all everything that could ever be is like logged there, and like we
Yeah,
can access those spaces too through altered states of consciousness.
yeah.
But I
Or
find
like
that to be
the
an interesting place.
idea of the pleroma in like Gnostic thought, that it's like this
Exactly.
fullness of everything. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing about Carl Jung also, is that he was conflicted within himself.
Hmm.
His writings that were published are bordering on the mystical, but they're still very couched in clinical psychology. And then you have like the Red Book, which is like
Yes.
personal visions, and it's
My
it's
wife bought
interesting,
me
like
the red book, for
amazing art
oh
also. I
my,
love his paintings.
oh dude, it's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that he has that conflict. I would say that, I am familiar with the idea of the Akashic record, and I find that interesting that there's this kind of universal ocean that we're all kind of droplets that have emerged from that universal ocean. And that's kind of why we have access to the completeness of all
Yeah.
experience. And there is this kind of almost a kind of sense that sometimes, when you do encounter something in a work of art, you do sometimes, when it's happening right, there is this kind of feeling of almost like deja vu or
Hmm.
familiarity.
Yes.
Even though you're seeing something new, you feel like you saw it already at some
Mm.
time. And I wonder if
Yes.
it isn't like some thing that like all these things have already happened in
Yes.
time. And you're just kind of like, you pulled it from that eternity, and
Yes. Oh,
um
what an amazing thought. I mean, I've talked about that with some friends of mine before, because I know exactly what you mean. But continue,
yeah,
continue.
no, and this actually goes towards something I was actually just saying to someone recently. I have this um feeling about art itself, the creation of art, that a lot of times people try to put art into categories based on its historical period. And also, like, I forgot to mention this, but I'm an art history teacher at, City University of New York colleges.
Awesome.
So, I'm sort of have to talk to students about art history in this kind of linear way where it's broken into periods of history and so forth. But the more I teach art history and the more I study it, the more I've actually come and practice painting myself, the more I've come to see art as originating from a place outside of time.
Mm,
And what I mean by that is that it's it's created in a place that's not really subject to future or past. And I know that sounds very weird,
no,
but
yeah.
I think also it's because time is very related to material constraints.
Yep.
Time exists because things are born and they die, they're
Yep.
created and then they decay. And art, even though a material object like a painting certainly has a birth and a death, the
Yes.
actual experience of its creating is somewhere not in that
Yes.
physical realm. So
Yes.
that's kind of my feeling about why it seems to be coming out of this eternity, this
Yes.
ocean of eternity somewhere.
Yeah, it's
You know,
outside of time. It's outside
yeah,
of time because I feel like when you're really deeply immersed in the studio, in the creative act, you are aligning yourself with the creative force of everything that is and has been or will be in
yeah,
some way. Like I think that is in a lot of times like our thread of connection back to the original cause or source, whatever we want to call it, if there is one. I mean, we could have a discussion around just that idea
yeah,
itself, but like the creative act, intentionally, channeling and making something, putting your time, your energy, your skill into something is aligning you with this creative force that is outside of time.
yes.
Time is a linear construct related to actual cycles itself.
Mhm.
And so, like, the only reason, you know what I mean? Yeah, we have birth and death, but then we also have rebirth because you just
Mhm.
watch the seasons cycle through. Something dies, like a seed dies in the ground, then all of a sudden it's born again as the next tree, so to speak. And so we see this cyclical quality in everything that is natural in its form, but we attribute onto like a cyclical system, a linear construct of time is moving one directionally. And so I sometimes think that no, we can go back in time as much as we can go forward in time. Like we can step outside of it at the same moment as well. And so even just the construct of time itself is a fascinating one. I know, I can imagine you probably felt this too in certain mystical states or experiences where you step into the eternal space outside of time. And it is the most visceral, knowing space of, I can't explain it. Like and the only reason you know you're back in time is because like all this, it's just like a switch. You
Yeah.
just, do you know what I'm talking about? Like when your consciousness has stepped outside of or any relationship with time, even if just for a moment, it's like one of the most incredible
I think I
feelings.
have. I think I have experienced something like that. That's, again, it's a very subjective experience.
Right.
I don't know if I experience your experience exactly
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
same way,
Exactly.
but I've definitely had experiences both in meditation and then also taking psychedelics where it seems as if you see the whole of time at once.
Mm,
You can feel infinitely forward and infinitely back.
yes.
So in that sense, yes. And I think, what you're talking about, that wheel or like Dharma or whatever you want to call it, it is cyclical, but I also think that there is a space outside of that wheel,
Yeah.
outside of that
Mhm.
cycle.
Yeah.
And somehow art connects us with that. It links us with that. I don't know how or
Yeah.
why, or
Yeah.
why that droplet, I always think of things as like liquid, flowing, that's my metaphor also in my
Yeah.
paintings stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know
Definitely.
why that droplet has to leave time and then come into this fleshy body in,
Hmm.
a material space. I don't exactly know why that's the way that it chooses to, express itself, but
But here we
that
are,
seems to be, here we are.
Yeah. No, it is. It
Um,
is. It is very mysterious. And when you look at like ancient history and various religious or spiritual traditions who speak on these things, there's some interesting ideas in there about like why this human experience exists or this material experience exists. Um, in some sense, it's almost like the universal one. individuated itself, broke itself into a bunch of pieces in order to know itself again, to
Mm.
back as a whole, or some kind of like, I feel like everything is just like a big inhale and exhale. It's like,
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that perspective expressed. I think that's very plausible that there is this kind of creation that has created all of this, or this essence that has created all of this as a way of experiencing itself or
yeah,
to mitigate its isolation. I would say that, and also as someone who's like written on other artists who've practiced mediumistic art, so they're claiming that a spirit or some kind of
like an
entity or
entity. Yeah.
force possesses them or works through them, uses their hands or their words to create something or transmit a message. Having looked at a lot of those examples, I can't say, assuming that their experiences are valid, taking that at face value,
Right. Exactly.
their subjective experiences are valid and not just psychological or, hallucinated or something. Taking that at face value, I can't say for certain myself, and I don't, what do I know about anything? But, having looked at all of this, I can't say myself whether those forces that seem to communicate through artists or mediums or channels, whether they are actual entities or intelligences outside of the physical realm or outside of time, or whether those are other aspects of yourself or of your own
Hmm.
soul.
Yeah.
I think of the ancient Egyptians, and there's a lot of other religions that have this belief, but the ancient Egyptians believed your soul had like several different parts. I think it was like 3 or 4 different parts, the Ka and the Ba, and then there's these other different aspects of it. And I think that is a very plausible
Yeah.
theory of how our interactions with seemingly, angels or spirits or whatever you think it is are actually happening. That you might have several different selves or
Hmm.
souls, if you prefer, existing in multiple places outside of here. And
Wow.
every now and then they like talk to the one that's in this vessel
Yes.
here,
Oh
and
man.
or work or just kind of dive into this body. Um so I think that's very possible that, what you might interact with, and this kind of goes towards, your conception of God or pleroma or the all, um, whether that is actually a separate creator intelligence or whether you're just an aspect of that or a fragment
Hmm.
from that,
Yeah.
very possible.
Exactly,
I
man. I
think
mean,
all those things are possibilities, but I don't know. I
yeah,
think it's very cool to think about.
definitely. I don't know
Yeah,
either, man. It's super like what you're talking about with like the Egyptian cosmological perspective of
yeah.
like the soul having multiple parts to it.
Mhm.
Like sometimes I have that feeling or that thought, or I contemplate that idea too, that like there's a part of my consciousness or soul or spirit, whatever, that is existing on various planes of consciousness or dimensions all at the same time. I'm particularly accessing this one right now, but in dream states, you can access or communicate with like those different parts, or mystical states, like there can be a cross communication happening. I don't know either. I know it's super vast and mysterious, and I know that the whatever the material philosophy is that's sort of like guiding the principles of this planet right now in the Western culture, like there's something missing. There's
Yeah.
definitely a piece of this puzzle missing, and I think that's what we are as artists, as thinkers, as people engaging intentionally with these ideas. We're trying to uncover what those missing pieces are and express our searching, our longing, our expression of seeking through our art making and through the way we write or the way we communicate, the way we just live our lives, in and of itself. But it's definitely what makes life very interesting for me and exciting, and gives it a sense of magic, because if you understood every component to reality as it was at face value, like I feel like that would be a really tough life to live. Wonder and mystery and majesty, magic, that is where, for me, like the juice of life is. That's what makes it so engaging and exciting to be a part of. And I don't know if we'll ever figure it out. And I think maybe that's part of the journey too. It's evolving. Like when I was talking earlier about like the cycles, I've seen also it illustrated like a spiral. We
Mhm.
see the spiral form, we see the nautilus everywhere in nature, so it's like, yeah, it's cyclical, but it's moving somewhere. You know what I mean? It's spiraling in a direction both forward and back in some way. So maybe even looking at cycles as like spirals of time is kind of interesting in and of itself too.
It does feel like we are moving somewhere somehow.
Yeah.
I don't exactly know where. I hope it's a good direction.
Yeah.
I don't know where, but I will say, like, even the preoccupation with artificial intelligence right now, I find artificial intelligence interesting. I'm not anti-technology. I'm a little disappointed with how AI art looks. I think it kind of looks terrible mostly, but no, it's true. Unfortunate, but it's just
I
interesting to
agree.
me. It's enough that that's where we want to go somehow, or where those who are generating technology, those working in those fields,
Yeah.
incredibly, intelligent and industrious and ambitious people are moving towards that direction. I find
Yeah.
interesting it because to make something like artificial intelligence, you have to understand what the human mind is to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
To make something that generates art, you have to understand what the soul is in order to
Mm-hmm.
generate art. So how are we going to use science or technology to understand those things?
Yeah.
Now, will we ever get there? Is this just kind of like chasing smoke or something? I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But that quest, which seems to be the quest of human technology right now, is interesting to me.
Yeah.
And maybe that is taking us somewhere in some spiral towards, what some people call the singularity, but
Yep.
maybe it's something other that we don't quite know yet.
Yeah, exactly. But what you have to realize is like at the end of the day, we could be advancing technologically at the highest rate you imaginable. But then all of a sudden the plug gets pulled and there's, you know what I mean? And
Solar
the solar
flare.
flare, it just
Yeah.
boom, all gone. And here we are
Agrarian society
back in our meat
returns.
suits.
Yeah.
Like all we have here is survival, like, back to like ground zero again. Because we become so attached to our technology and so reliant upon it for better and for worse. And so, what we like everything else, like it is ephemeral, it has a beginning and an end, and it has a lot of vulnerabilities to it. And so, my biggest concern with our obsession with the singularity, with transhumanism, with like all of those sort of like interesting ideas that a lot of techno futurists and technologists, industrialists like think about is that, but if the plug gets pulled, if we lose all communication systems and electronic systems, like what do we have? And then we have nothing. And then we have a bunch of people who don't even know how to feed themselves. And
That is definitely the case in a lot of I can speak for America here, a lot of modern and industrialized 21st century America. There's a lot of the world that will be fine, however, without technology, maybe even
exactly.
flourishing without it. But I think another problem with philosophies like transhumanism, which is a kind of philosophy that incorporates technology, I think a problem that I see with it is that it doesn't have a spiritual dimension.
Exactly.
It doesn't have any kind of allowance for things like paranormal phenomenon or visions or the imagination or the imaginal.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a reason why I'm actually skeptical about whether transhumanism or new tech like AI tech is going to be able to progress on the track that it is, because it seems too embedded in a materialist worldview. I
Yes.
think, and I think that might be what ends up slowing the gears on that at some
Yeah.
point, or maybe not. Maybe
Yeah.
they'll
I mean,
invent
we're
a
going to
psychic
find out
computer.
ultimately. We're going to find out ultimately. But I think no matter what's happening on that end, I know you're going to continue to be painting and doing all the amazing things you're doing and studying and learning and experiencing your own consciousness and exploring that and letting that be sort of like the impetus behind the creative act that moves through you. And when we see work that comes from those spaces, it's going to inspire us to think beyond the material, to think that there is mystery beyond. Science can't know all the answers, never has, never will. And so there's always going to be this piece of the pie missing unless you take initiative in your life to explore it for yourself. Because that's the one thing we all have is a consciousness, a spirit, a soul, whatever we want to call it. Like we said earlier, words are limiting. They're not the thing itself. Don't mistake the word for the thing that we're speaking to, but we all have that. And so, by the nature, we can explore that. We can expand that. We can come to understand it and know it in new, novel ways that might benefit our lives for the better. And so I think at the end of the day, I know you do. And as I want to encourage everybody out there listening to explore your mind, explore your heart, explore your soul. There's much more than what we could ever understand going on around here. And don't forget that. Don't let the materialist take over your mind and negate your soul.
That's a good message to
man. I mean, it's a great conversation. I mean, we're a little over an hour and like 8 minutes right now, which is awesome. And
cool.
I feel like we could just keep going. I mean, there's so many like little rabbit holes. I was like, oh, should we dive down that one? Oh, let's go to this one. But that's the beauty and nature of this kind of thing. And I'd imagine there's definitely going to be more conversations in the future where we can maybe get more specific about a topic. Like I was saying earlier, now that we've kind of opened the doors of communication, we have this ground that we're working with, we can continue to explore moving into the future. But just want to thank you so much for taking your time to be with me, for sharing everything that you shared today. It was just a really incredible conversation. So, and everybody out there who's listening, do not miss a chance to check out Alessandro's work. I'll have all the links in the show notes. Please check it out and see what we're talking about here. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll have seen a bunch of paintings flash by through the course of this conversation. And if you're in New
York, I have a solo show up right now at Waterhouse and Dodd in New York.
Yes. How long is that show up for?
It's up until June 22nd. So
I don't know if this episode will release
might be too late, but
it's all good. I know there's going to be more shows, and when there are, I'll definitely be sharing them out for to the audience of people who are listening. But thank you so much again for your time, and I look forward to connecting more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk.
Yeah, definitely. Talk soon, all right?
All right.
Peace. Bye-bye. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Concerning the Spiritual and Art. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can stay in touch and in tune with all the amazing offerings that we're going to be bringing to this channel. Thanks again for all your support. Super grateful, and excited to bring more content your way. Peace, y'all.